Well, some newspapers.
Hello. Hello, everybody. If everybody can take their seats. And I trust there was enough food for everybody. It looked very good out there. Good spread. Okay, I'll just wait a second here to everybody get set up. Okay, welcome back, everybody. This morning we have explored trust and heard some interesting discussions about the current state and the future of our business. And now, for our luncheon keynote, we get a perspective from south of the border. Fiona?
Thank you. So welcome to you, Sam Gill. And Kevin Newman, we're very pleased to have you here hosting or doing this interview. As you all know, Kevin Newman is the host of W5. He's a journalist who's literally seen it all, from all sides, north and south. And I have to say he's a colleague of mine. I think we figured out we've worked together about 30 years. We were children, right, when that started? And also he's a very dear friend, and I'm very pleased that he's here today, and I'm very proud to say that we are honoring Kevin tonight with the President's Award. So thank you, Kevin, and congratulations.
Thanks, Fiona and George. Appreciate it very much. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks. It's good to be. It's great to just escape kind of the overwhelming daily Trudeau coverage in the U.S. So it's it's exhausting.
It's unrelenting, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Jesus, we're even tired of him here. You first of all, let's just for context talk a bit about the Knight Foundation, what kind of work it does, and your role at it.
Yeah, so Knight Foundation is the wealth that was accrued by the Knight newspaper company, which is, many of you know, was sort of its heyday the largest newspaper company in the U.S. And we really focus on two things: journalism, and then the set of communities where the Knight brothers made their money. And sort of our animating idea is really theirs, and the idea that ran their newspapers, which is if people have the information they need and the opportunity to have a voice, then they can really determine their own futures, and that essentially is the essence of democracy. So that's what we do and what we try to invest in the U.S.
So we've already this morning, I guess, heard from Daryl Bricker and some of the issues about trust in Canada. Edelman as well has done some research into that. Give me a sense of how broad your survey was of the same kinds of attitudes in America. Yeah,
so we did a sort of a major survey that came out in January of 20,000 Americans across the country. So this is really actually the largest kind of media sort of survey just about attitudes toward media in at least a long time, if not ever. And then in terms of what we explored, it ranged from everything to how people feel about the media, validating a lot of the conventional wisdom we heard about this morning, to what role media plays in a democracy and how that is changing in a world in which sort of the discourse and the intercourse of that democracy is changing because of technology.
So anecdotally, I suspect it's changing dramatically and very quickly. Is that what you found?
Yeah, I think what we found is that the things in the U.S. that we think we know about the media are basically true. So net favorability, very low. Feeling that it's hard to separate out, bias from fact, more intense than it ever was. Feeling that the media has gotten less accurate, higher than it ever was. I think what sort of really came through profoundly is that, if it's something that's bad, it's twice as bad as it was 30 years ago, and it's something that's good, it's half as good as it was about 30 years ago. So that's what we really found, was just sort of how profoundly some of these trends have taken hold.
So was that your measure 30 years ago? Because I might even say 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the declines have been precipitous. I think sort of the benchmarks too, when you really, the time in which a majority of people said, I can figure out, I've got enough sources to figure out what's true, what's not. I think the media is less biased than it is biased. The last time that you had sort of net positive ratings on those things was really the 80s in the U.S.
So I guess here's the fear and the alarm that a lot of journalists are feeling, and that's the notion that in the United States, facts are fading. Did you find anything to back up that fear?
I think there's a couple things that we found. I think the first thing we found, and we heard about this a little bit earlier today, is certainly in the U.S., polarization is eating every institution alive. So the issue is not so much for the Fox News viewer or the MSNBC viewer, someone mentioned this, that what's your journalistic process for getting the facts, and I do or don't have trust in that process. The issue is, I've got a side, and you've got a side. And so I approach what you're doing as having a side. We haven't released these results yet, but we were just in the field with Gallup studying people's views about bias, accuracy, and misinformation among actual major news properties. And we did some that are sort of generally in the middle, and then some that are sort of identifiably on the left, identifiably on the right. And what's interesting is bias, accuracy, and misinformation plot essentially on a sort of a linear standard deviation of regression of 1. They're completely interlinked. And so what that says to me is that people aren't, these words don't mean anything. The meaningful thing is, what's my side, what's my identity?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, because those words like bias, misinformation, and accuracy, I mean, everybody can say my side is those things, the other side isn't. Is that the problem, that the definition of what those things, there's no middle ground anymore, or are vanishing middle ground?
I think that's part of the problem. I mean, I think part of the challenge is, climate change. The climate change debates about science were the real harbinger for this. I think there was this moment when it became clear that to say scientists say X was perceived by people as a political speech act, rather than a real appeal to meaningful authority. I think that's what we're seeing happening. So it's not that the facts don't matter. It's that there's this a priori interaction with what side are you on that obscures our willingness, our ability to engage with facts. And I think a lack of trust that authority of information is being presented independent of the facts. I'll say, the other thing that we found is that, and this is where you actually really do see bipartisan agreement in the US, is that people are acutely aware that in a digitally mediated information environment, it's just very hard to sort things out. And someone else mentioned this on the panel, saying that there isn't a lot of differentiation among the audience between different news brands in Canada. And what I would say is, there isn't much differentiation among audiences between any kind of source. People are just being assaulted with a piece of information that comes from your news organization, a piece of information that comes from their uncle, a piece of information that comes from their friend, a piece of information that comes from an organization with an identifiable political agenda. And I think consumers are actually pretty smart in saying, how am I going to know what the piece of authority is that's behind this atomic unit of information that's bombarding me in a social media feed?
So I want to talk about that in a little bit, because that may be, get us to one of the points of like transparency and solutions, and developing a way to educate people in how to know. But when everyone is being bombarded from all the sources of information, opinion, facts, whatever people call it, are Americans feeling better informed or less informed?
I think this is the really profound thing that we found, and I think it gets to the heart of where responsibility is ultimately going to land. We asked people that just straight out. You've got more information available to you than ever before. More informed, less informed. 60% say they feel less informed. And I think the word "feel" there is really critical. I think the thing the Knights took for granted was that people could be informed, and I think now we're living in a world where we have to confront, whether people actually feel that way, whether people feel that they have the efficacy with the information that they encounter.
And what did they say? Did they say they did? Like the
no,
people
they said they feel overwhelmed. They feel overwhelmed, and that I think is something, frankly, that is in some ways not even a journalism question. I mean, that's something that I think a Facebook and a Google has to confront. I think that's something regulators have to confront, media organizations as well. I mean, but I think it's something consumers have to confront. What is our responsibility going to be as citizens in an environment in which we're not feeling very informed?
So often when people are overwhelmed, they just shut down. We're obviously seeing, various paces and various stages of the contraction of traditional media. But is it your belief that are you seeing in the United States anyway, evidence that in light of the amount of overwhelming information, the feeling that opinion and facts are the same thing, that people are just going, I'm just not paying attention?
We saw that among some people. We tried to look at some archetypes of different kinds of news consumers, and there are some archetypes that say, I follow the news, I want to follow the news, and I'm doing my best. And some people more optimistic that they can sort out opinion from fact. Some people less optimistic, and then you see a whole segment of people, probably about half, who say, look, it's just kind of too much for me. So I think that's I think that's a good question that we're going to have to figure out. Are people just sort of turning away? I think, again, in the U.S. context, the thing that's really worrying, I think that we should be worried about is, again, people who tend to feel engaged and optimistic tend to self-identify as Democratic or progressive, and they tend to be higher educated. And that's just not the majority of people that are making decisions as citizens in our democracy. It's an important segment of that population, but it's not everybody.
So are people tribally sort of falling back now? I mean, there are a number of people, I think, in your survey where I saw that, they still say, no, I actually look for, a range of opinion, knowing that this is a conservative outlet, knowing this is a liberal. What's happening to those sort of middle mush people?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, one of the things we asked people about was sort of different questions to get at this issue of filter bubbles or echo chambers. So, most people agree that it's not a good thing to either to check out or to just go kind of find information that confirms what you already believed. What we also found is most people share content with someone because they think they'll agree with it. So so either you have cognitive dissonance or you have a lot of honesty, which is that people recognize that they alone are not going to be the solution to the problem, and that our own instincts are to go confirm what we thought. I mean, I don't know, and some people talked about this on the past panel. I don't know that there was this golden age where people said, well, there's multiple sides to every issue. I have a set of beliefs, but I need to confront facts and deal with those facts. I'm not sure there ever was that time. I think what there was, and someone mentioned this, is first that your local newspaper was the shared set of facts, and no matter what your beliefs were, that wasn't going to be up for debate. And second, and more importantly, that power, whether that is elected officials in government or companies or whoever, was somehow accountable to what those facts were. I think the attenuation of that dynamic is a more powerful thing. It used to not be the case uniformly that the fact that if I was an elected official, if I was, say, the President of the United States, that my tribe agreeing with me was the only important thing. That if the facts disagreed with me, I was somehow accountable to that. I think the attenuation of that dynamic is something that absolutely should be worrying, and the way that people are either turning away or resorting to tribe, I think, enables that lack of accountability.
One of the great things about the Knight Foundation is that it's been around for a long time, and it's got, as you say, it's got data that goes back decades. Anybody who's attended these conferences when Fiona and I started maybe 30 years ago probably would have heard a similar kind of discussion going on about, worry, anxiety, hand-wringing. But is something different now? Have you picked up that the pace of change, the pace of the loss of faith is you're in Canada, I'll call it, is hockey sticking, is going like that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the reality of a digitally mediated world is that the clock is more rapid for everybody, and that's the sense. I mean, look, my journalism experience is driving the University of Chicago's Independent Monthly into bankruptcy, which I guess is like relevant knowledge for this era. But you
can be hired as a consultant in a bunch of places.
Right, exactly. So I don't, but what I hear from you and your colleagues is, that clock has an impact on everything. It's impacting what consumers want, how they want it. It's impacting the way decisions are made within news organizations, the kind of content. So I think there's sort of no question that the pace of change is intensifying. Certainly. I think also it's on the supply side, how large the supply is. I mean, I think people are getting information from so many different sources in so many different ways. This is something we might get to. I think, one thing that we're starting to talk about in the U.S., but I don't think we talk about enough is, what's the social obligation of the companies that have made the internet not a layer, but the layer in which we're interacting with each other and interacting with information? Because I think all of those forces you're talking about are not the unintended consequence of that business model. They're the intended consequence of that business model. The intended consequence of the business model is I can connect with people and information all over the world instantly. I can do it when I want, and I can do it in a way that's native to this thing which I carry around with me. And that arc will continue. We gave away an Echo was the prize.
Right.
One of the questions someone asked was, how will you get the news in 10 years? I think the way you'll get the news in 10 years is you'll be standing somewhere and say, Alexa, what's going on today? You won't be at home. You'll be anywhere. And so I think that is not something that news organizations are going to figure out on their own. what does it mean to be informed in an environment in which those are the expectations of consumers?
But you raise the interesting point about these like large, let's call them Facebook, the Googles, the Amazons of the world, whose entire being is built on the idea that let's break it, period. Like let's just disrupt. Right? And so what we're seeing now is a point where, the kids in the back room in the garage who still view themselves that way are now actually the captains of industry, but haven't taken on the mantle of responsibility. Yeah. Do you see a point where this isn't just a conversation for news organizations? Are you hearing from, tech companies that there is this understanding that disruption by itself is part of the problem and that they have responsibility for that?
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, in the 2 weeks around when Mark Zuckerberg was called to testify in front of Congress, Facebook lost 15% of its market capitalization. That's something companies respond to. I also think that a year ago, Zuckerberg said you'd be an idiot to think that Facebook had an impact on the U.S. election. They're talking very differently about it. A year is not a long time. And I think that this wouldn't be the first industrial cluster in a developed democracy to have to go through these growing pains. I mean, everyone's sort of searching for the analogy of what's going on. Some I think are better than others. I tend to think about like auto regulation as a good example of this. The things we liked about cars were the things that made them dangerous. We wanted them bigger, we wanted them faster. The odyssey of going from that to regulating cars to Volvo is competing on safety, that's a 40 or 50-year arc. We may not have that much time with these companies, but I'm actually an optimist that we'll be able to take on some of these questions. I think there are a few things that are more challenging about what these companies are doing. I think one is that these companies rely implicitly on the idea that technology will just progress. And that's inevitable. Well, that's not true. They're making decisions about the way it progresses and how it progresses. And we're a society, and we can make decisions about what we want that technology to do or not. The start of this conversation was one of those great things. We want technology to be on demand and fun and addictive. We might also want it to inform us. That may be a value that we are going to want to levy. So I think that's a challenge. I think the other challenge is that cars were an important part of our society, but a part. I think the challenge here is these companies have created platforms that are literally the layer for governance, for commerce, for social life. So the ubiquity of these companies, I think, are going to make them, uniquely challenging to deal with.
It was interesting. I noticed. I don't know if you guys saw that the Weather Channel. Is it the Weather Channel in the States? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that they basically put out a statement and said we're not going to cooperate with Facebook anymore because we get lots of likes, we get lots of page views, but we haven't yet seen a red cent from it. So the idea that there are people with content that are just going to sort of get it because that's where the game is, we may be seeing an evolution in that as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And obviously some news organizations feel very hostage to these dynamics. Other ones say, look, we are the content, so something's got to give. And again, I think one of the challenges for you all as an industry is the future figuring out how to preserve a content model and monetize that content model, or is it actually figuring out how to preserve a set of values that are going to be produced in a very different content model? And some people will lose.
Isn't that where we have a problem? Because I was looking at some of the stuff in Edelman and some of your own as well. And when you think about the audience or the viewer in the case of broadcasting, 63% say that our values are all about getting it first and making money and waking them up.
Yeah.
Did you see things like that? And I know you've done a lot of work as well in local news. Yeah. That while we're all sort of hand-wringing about content, we're actually losing the value argument.
Yes and no. One of the things. So I'll talk about two pieces of work we did. The poll that we're talking about. We asked the question. Basically, what do you think the media is important for a democracy? What are the reasons it's important? We were surprised to learn that, first, people do think it's important, but it's less connecting me to my community. It's a lot more keeping me informed about public affairs and holding power accountable. Now, that's meaningful in a community, too. Mm-hmm. So I think that applies nationally and locally. What they said was, we don't think you're doing a very good job of it, for all the reasons that we've described. Mm-hmm. And so that's a big thing to deal with. Mm-hmm. We also recently released a series of reports, and the last one just came out this week about the audience on local television. A lot of this discussion is about national television or about major newspapers. There's been less study in the U.S. about local TV. What was really interesting is a couple things. One is the audience is definitely older, but the most significant decline in the audience in local television is actually 35 to 45. It's not 30 and younger. And it's happening in urban areas. So there's a lot of communities in the rest of both of our countries where people are still going to local TV news. And we were also finding that there were a lot of stations locally that were seeing themselves as more than just a broadcast station. And that was starting to show some real success.
Talk to me a bit more about that, because we're seeing the same thing in Canada. There are, basically local newspapers that are under extreme financial stress. A lot of them have collapsed. Some television and web organizations are saying there's opportunity here. Have you seen that dynamic in the United States where television stations with their content end up sort of occupying the print space in smaller cities?
We've seen all kinds of things. I mean, we've seen there are local television stations that are packaging all kinds of web native content. That could be text, that could be video. We've seen interesting enterprise collaborations where there'll be that N,000 word investigative piece on the local paper, and they'll do a TV segment. We've seen, wraparound, where you've got the broadcast hit and then you've got something else going on in the newspaper or online. I think, look, the hardest place to innovate is when you actually have a reliable revenue stream, but you sort of know the business model is going away. But we are seeing some local television stations, broadcast stations leap into that. What I would say we're also seeing is the local upstarts, by and large, I can't say this authoritatively, the way they're defining success is not bailing gold the way that a night newspaper company would that enabled the foundation I work at to exist. They're getting by. They're finding a way to deliver news in new and interesting ways and build an audience and also get by. And that may be the other reckoning. This may just not be a way to bail gold that it was in the past.
Is it? Well, I think that's probably true. But do you see an alternative to local television or even radio news forming in the United States yet?
Totally. I think absolutely. I mean, I think that some of the ones that people talk about in the U.S. are, first you've got new models of local, Texas Tribune, Voice of San Diego. That's an alternative. They can do digital print, they can do video, they can do live events, and they can do it with 30 people. It's a lot. I don't have to tell you guys that a huge part of the capital investment is broadcasting the signal. So that's something that we've seen that can actually exist. The other thing we've seen is the deep issue vertical. Whether it's Chalkbeat on education or a Marshall Project on criminal justice. Those models have limitations, but they have dramatically lower ProPublica on investigations with a syndication model. I mean, these things dramatically reduce the kind of capital investment it takes to get to that great product.
And is anybody working on subscriptions yet in broadcast that you've seen? I mean, that seems to be the way that newspapers are moving. Do you see anybody experimenting with that in broadcast? We see it on the public media side, which obviously in the U.S. has a much larger, a really significant tradition of a membership model. And a lot of those folks say, well, Netflix, we invented that model of having, having loyal members. I don't think it's quite the same thing. So I couldn't tell you that I've seen someone who's definitely onto something, but you're seeing interesting experimentation without a doubt. One of the stats I thought was really interesting is that, and how possible this could be, that there could be a time not too far away where people just simply do not consume local news. And I looked at the breakdown in your survey of how often do you use local news in a week, and people my age, 97%. All the time. You go to 18 to 24, it's only 55%. So they're not, they're looking at news, they're not looking at local news. Do you see that as a growing threat where, and especially in Canada, if we're going to see the disintegration of newspapers in, medium-sized cities, is it a habit that, younger people are getting out of? It's interesting. I think you could speculate reasons that there's probably a lot of reasons that that's happening. Well, first of all, 55% is not bad. If we could get 55% of an emerging demographic with some intensity and could monetize it, that's not a terrible thing. I think
I think there's a few things that might be going on there. One is that's a generation that's grown up with a product that's gotten a lot worse year by year in quality. It's not a product that necessarily demands readership. So can we get to those models that are giving a good product? Secondly, that is a generation that wants to consume the product in a different way. And I do think, one of the things we've seen at Knight Foundation is a lot of news organizations, particularly local ones, are trying to take a newspaper product and put it online. That's not what this audience wants. This audience wants to consume content differently, participate in content differently. I think
they like raw, don't they? They seem to respond to raw video or something that isn't quite as packaged.
Raw that's not linear. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that we could learn that they can engage with. I mean, I think that's something that we're seeing. I think that, the other thing is, and this is where I do think news organizations bear some responsibility, is like all we're feeding people is national news. I mean, as someone who's not in journalism, I do find it. I think Donald Trump is a genius the way that he blows up a news cycle, and we make decisions to tell people that all that matters is the partisan debate of the moment about Donald Trump's tweets, and if that's all you're feeding people, then that's what they're gonna. Then by definition, that's what they're gonna follow.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find it now. There was something I thought too, is that like local television news generally, and I think this is true in Canada as well, hasn't really changed much in its format or in its, and so but in your report on the future of local TV news, you talk about how local TV news must get better, and that there was this Harry Jessel, co-founder of NewsCheck Media, came up with a list of things that are criticisms of local TV news from the audience's point of view, and one of them is a format that hasn't changed in decades, uninspiring writing, makeup and hair and dress that add 10 to 15 years to young anchors. Anchors dressed for fantasy cocktail parties at 5 o'clock in the morning, a sometimes permeable wall between editorial and sales, and too much weather. I mean, if you look at the amount of experimentation that's going on in the States, do you see much of it in the local news, or are people just, as you said, sort of hanging on to format because it's proven to be a cash cow in the 80s?
And it's a cash cow now because of retransmission. I mean, again, the hardest place to innovate is when you've got a reliable revenue stream, but you know that the audience is going to change over time. We are actually seeing, and Knight is now invested in a number of efforts. Where we've invested in an innovation lab at University of at Arizona State, which owns the local public media affiliate there. We actually are seeing some stations doing things very differently, which I think is incredibly exciting. I think we heard this morning about taking risk, even if you lose some of your older audiences, is the thing that you've got to be willing to do. We're seeing people do web-only packages. We're seeing people get reporters out there actually going to the story. We're seeing more investigation happening. I mean, well, I don't know if you guys have this, but we'll have, if you watch, like a late night show in the U.S., like a Stephen Colbert or a Conan O'Brien, like they'll do these packages, partly because of the size of our media markets, where they'll show all the anchors like in a concatenation do the same intro.
That's the Sinclair thing, right?
Yeah. Consumers are smart, and they know these things, and especially in a web-only world, they know these things are happening, and younger consumers like to make fun of these things. So I think we are seeing TV stations try different things. I think. Some are going to over the top. I mean, look, the hardest thing to do in a company is in a corporate environment is to compete against yourself. But TV is actually, at least in the U.S., I don't know the economics as well here, has the resources to compete against itself. And we'd love at Knight to encourage that to happen as much as possible.
So what else are you thinking and being told makes a difference? Because one of the things we talked about earlier was how people are feeling overwhelmed. One of the things that I feel, anyway, is that we're not often transparent enough in the process of how we make decisions. And that every once in a while, if you say, we're not too sure, but this is what we think, you're letting people in and training them to sort of figure out what brand value you have as a traditional organization. Have you guys done much work on that? And have you heard whether or not there's a desire for that in some of the people you've surveyed?
We've done some, and we've less in our surveys, more in our actual grant making. We've experimented with that. I mean, I think there's no question that is a part of the future. The question is, how much of the future will that be? So, there's a really interesting company that started as part of Chicago Public Radio called Hearken in the U.S., which works with media organizations to enable residents to dictate more what the agenda is going to be. They've had an incredible amount of success in how engaged the audience has been. And they've also had success in working with news organizations to ask, what is that right stat? Is it clicks or is it the intensity of engagement? And we'll need to figure that out. We've seen some really interesting experiments in making people a part of the process. ProPublica, now has started something that's now standard practice, which is when they do a story, they're thinking about doing a story, they say, we're thinking about doing this story. If you're implicated in this story, come to us. And that's another part of the future. I think one of the great things, again, we talk so much about the halcyon age. Me Too. And I don't know what that debate's been like in Canada. I think that is an incredibly exciting development for a ton of reasons. One is it's people forcing the story onto the agenda and participating in it. But secondly, I think it's changing the way that the editorial side is thinking about news. Those stories were clearly cropping up in news organizations, and what editors would say, I am sure, is, look, I believe this might be a thing, but it's tough to corroborate. Here's what the sources we have to do. Now we're seeing all this reporting on it. The reporting is still journalism, but it's forcing people to say, okay, what other kinds of corroboration can we get? Can we be upfront with the audience about the kinds of corroboration that we're getting? They're different than what we used to have, and we're reporting on the stories. I think that's exciting. I think that's going to bring a huge amount of the audience in. The other thing that I would say, and if I knew the answer to this, I wouldn't be working at Knight Foundation. I'd be working in media, making a lot of money, which is the skepticism's not going to go away. The younger audiences are also the most skeptical, and they recognize that a digital media environment that they love and they don't want to turn away from is a part of what engenders that skepticism. We see the same thing. We do polling about college students around free expression issues in the U.S., and they love online discourse. They also say that there's too much hate speech. They also say that there's too much harassment. These people aren't turning away. They want to engage with news, I believe, in a way that's going to be authentic to the endemic challenge of skepticism, lack of trust. And I think when news organizations start to figure that out, we're going to be onto something.
Well, but I wonder if we're moving in the opposite direction. If you look at where cuts are happening, particularly in newspapers, the public editors, the ombudsman's positions are vanishing at a crazy rate. So instead of, if you're right and the impulse that we should be following is more transparency, admit our mistakes, explain our process, it sounds like journalism is retrenching.
Yeah, and I think that's a good insight. And I wish I knew the answer. I don't think that. I'm skeptical, but I could be wrong, that we're going to get to a digitally mediated information environment where it's just really clear what's true and false. And so we'll be able to go back to this period of just extreme trust. I just don't think that's going to be happen. I do think we might get to an environment where if you want to know what's true or you want to know why it might be true, it's much easier to do that. And it's much easier to sort out the places that are trying to do that from the places that aren't trying to do that. But I'm not sure. On the other hand, you talk to some technology executives who are working in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they say, this is a technical problem, and the future public editor will be an AI platform that will get you to the truth. So, like I said, if I knew the answer, I'd be making more money.
There's a conference coming up in a couple of weeks in Waterloo about tech for good, and this concern that and it may not be a concern, it may be our salvation, in fact, that at some point people look at technology not as improving their lives, but as making it more complicated, more difficult to show facts, and there's actually a counter-revolution, almost like a Middle Ages against technology. So who knows whether AI triggers that and brings back, as you say, some level of trust.
I think there might be, I think it's possible, and this is something we hope to invest in smarter people to explore, frankly. We're starting to see the signs of what you might call the ergonomics movement for tech, which is, imagine I was talking to one of the founders of Kickstarter, and he said, why is it that the calendar, your Outlook calendar, or whatever you guys use, seems to make you busier? We're going to get to a calendar that's smart enough to say, I want to protect your time, Kevin, and I'm actually going to fend off. And it could be that information and trust becomes a part of that movement. where we start to say one of the values that we seek out of these devices is feeling more informed. And by the way, I do think that I would suspect that like a Google, I think those executives take seriously. We started because we were trying to connect people to true knowledge in the world.
Yeah.
And we want to be able to do that more effectively, and we ought to make our platform do that. Now, I think they're also dealing with institutional investors who say, where's my EBITDA? But by the way, all the news organizations in this room are dealing with institutional investors who say, where's my EBITDA? And that's what leads to that, that decline in the editorial side of the product.
So we're going to open it up to a couple of questions, but I just have one more for you. I mean, how much of this is just Donald Trump and his fake news? Because when you look at the results in Canada, and you have a 4% drop, but still 65%. You look at the Edelman report. In fact, they in October showed a 17% increase in trusted media in Canada. When you talk about is it possible that trust can be rebuilt, the erosion doesn't seem to be as great here. Does that mean that America is a window into our own future, or is it unique to this time in America?
I think it's very dangerous practice to come to Canada and say America is the future. You'll get run out of town. But I think here I think there are clearly some differences. I think that I don't think it helps to have a president who's putting the media on trial. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think it's just a factual matter that if you have the president out there saying it's all fake news, that has an impact on how people think. And I do think it also forces news organizations to take an adversarial stance, which in a tribalized, polarized environment leads to, again, people saying Washington Post, I don't care about your process. It's what side are you on? So I would suspect that that's a part of it. I also think that one of the people on the last panel talked about media fragmentation. This is a less fragmented media environment than the U.S. and will continue to be a less fragmented media environment than the U.S. And that hopefully will also be a bulwark against some of what we've seen in the U.S. On the other hand, I think that there are some really critical trends that we're seeing. Every developed democracy is dealing with a polarization challenge. Every developed democracy is dealing with a legacy audience that's also aging out. And Sue Gardner, who was a longtime president at CBC, actually wrote a piece for Knight Foundation on the future of public media. And as she pointed out, there's no public media system in the developed world that's not suffering from these same business model challenges. I also think that every developed democracy is dealing with the intensification of technology being the dominant platform. So I hope, to hell, that we're not the future of what Canada will be. And it's just as exciting for Americans to see Canada be a real shining beacon of what a multicultural developed democracy can do and can look like. I also think that there's just no chance that Canada is exempt from the macro trends, frankly, that are challenging democratic institutions of any kind. I mean, we're seeing in the U.S. Polarization taking hold of people's views on higher education now. I mean, there's just no institution that is exempt from these trends, and we're going to have to figure it out. I don't think democracies have always faced new kinds of problems. Global, how is global democracy going to thrive was a really big problem for the 40s to 50s. How is democracy going to become pluralistic was a really big problem for the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Our new problem, I think, is how is democracy going to thrive in a technology era? So we'll figure it out, but it's going to take time, and you all are going to be a part of that.
Cool. Questions for Sam? Yeah.
Having said all that, and considering everything I've listened to today, I wonder if there's not a role for the Knight Foundation, similar foundations, and for broadcasters ourselves, although it's not our core value or activity, to somehow help answer the question, what does it mean to be informed? What is the future of local news, et cetera? What are social responsibility in context of? Can we support the idea of digital media literacy and concepts of digital citizenship to help people come to a better recognition of what is fake news, what is important, how do I stay informed, and this, by extension, protects the value of our legacy brands because it will draw people back to recognizing there are trusted sources, and maybe I need some help define them. I think we don't even think about concepts such as this real media literacy in Canada or digital citizenship.
Yeah. I think it's a great question. I mean, I think, so we've funded some efforts around that. It's, we could have a longer discussion about how they'll work. I think you're right. I mean, one of the things I mentioned earlier is no one's off the hook, and that means people too. We actually ask people, whose responsibility do you think it is to be informed? A news organization or yours? They're split 50-50. That means it's both. And you're starting to see that conversation take hold in the U.S. as well. I think it will be challenging. 100+ years ago, we used to talk about in democratic capitalism, we used to talk about the rights of citizens. 50 years ago, we talked about the rights of consumers. Well, consumers are still in transactions with companies. Now we're talking about the rights of users. Well, like, what the hell is a user? And I think the way that technology companies think about it is, I'm not even implicated in the transaction. You're just coming on my platform, and you're having a transaction with someone else. I don't think that's going to hold. I think GDPR, which rolled out over the last couple of days, we all got 100 emails today on new privacy policies. GDPR in Europe is I think an effort to say, no, you can't just say they're users and they are not in a transaction with you in which they have rights and responsibilities. So that's what makes me an optimist. The companies can't run from that. And I think that if you talk to technology executives, they'll tell you, we're not going to be able to ignore Brussels when it comes to this set of questions. And they'll say the same thing about Canada if Canada gets aggressive, and they'll absolutely say the same thing about the U.S. if we can get our act together. So I think you're absolutely right. The other thing I would say is Canadian foundations have started to call us to talk about, what can we do? And my advice to you all in the industry would be, as a funder, if you really want to tackle these issues, have those conversations. Don't go say, pay for our content. Our business model's evaporating. We need someone to keep paying for our great content. Foundations do not have enough money to bail out the content. Bring those questions to them. What can we learn about where the audience is going? How can we seed innovative practices that all of us could replicate? If you give foundations those sorts of opportunities, that's what they can invest in, and that's the role they can play. It's going to be your audience, and to a larger extent in Canada and the U.S., your government that's ultimately going to be able to come up with a different funding mix.
I saw a startup in the States that has decided to take a look at the teaming of what journalists do. And the inclination has been to just pile it all onto one person. But this sounded like something that just makes sense to me. I mean, if I grew up in the television era, I was a reporter, there was a cameraman, there was an editor. It wasn't all everybody doing everything. And there's now an organization that's twinning reporters with platform experts, so that when you're out there reporting, somebody's taking care of the reporting aspect of stuff and the verification, but somebody else is building the data and the graphs and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that sounds to me like an exciting way for even a traditional news organization to look at the distribution of their content in a different way.
Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff foundations can invest in. So what we fund, for example, I think this is public. If it's not, I'm going to get in trouble. But
That's okay. Nobody reports here.
Fortunately, what we do in some small town is not news in Canada. But what one thing, it's just one example, but one thing we've invested in is Center for Investigative Reporting in the U.S., which is a nonprofit that's totally reinvented itself in amazing ways. They've got this podcast platform you might know about called Reveal, which syndicates content, which is incredible. We funded them to partner with 4 local news operations that don't need podcasting platforms and also don't have the best investigative reporting platforms as a shared service. And one of the things we want to find out is just that. Can you have more shared services on the expertise side? The reporting is always going to be local. You're always going to need that person who lives there to go get the story. So I think that kind of stuff is incredibly promising. I also think it's totally non-competitive. If someone can figure that out, every organization in this room can do that thing, and then they've got to compete the same way media organizations have always competed. I can do it better, faster, and for my audience. Well, that's the right kind of competition to have in media.
Right. More questions? Sure.
The food coma is setting in.
Yeah.
I can do Trump questions. That's the only thing that Americans are ever good for.
I was interested in, you were talking earlier about people don't feel as informed these days as they used to. And I'm wondering if that's in part because our attention spans are shrinking to such a degree that we can't take in a lot of information. I mean, I got an email from my digital producer saying a story I wrote yesterday got a 1 minute and 35 seconds average time that people were on it, which was a big win because usually you're fighting for a minute. So if you're not staying on stories, like you're, for less than a minute, and then they're on to the next, how can they feel informed, and how can they feel like they have a grasp on what's happening and kind of go deeper? So I'm wondering if becoming more distracted as a society and really as a species of human beings.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all been in meetings where people are on their phones. I was in a meeting about respect in the workplace, and people are on their phones, and it's becoming acceptable.
Yeah.
And so, and even at night, you want to lie down and watch TV, you might have the iPad on at the same time.
Yeah.
You're kind of doing both. So I'm just wondering if that goes hand in hand with feeling less informed, and because we don't have the capacity, we're losing it.
Yeah.
And should we dumb what we're doing down to meet that, where the people are?
I think it's a great, No, I think there are some things that aren't new, some things that are new. So what's not new? I mean, Democratic theorist Joseph Schumpeter said 70 years ago, like, look, most people don't care. Like, they care about their lives, they care about their families, they care about their job, and they have limited attention span. There was a great podcast put out by Slate called Slow Burn about Watergate, and sort of reminding us that it wasn't kind of one moment. So it was sort of about the arc of the story. But audiences were saying, people, Nixon's hardcore base, they didn't believe in him because they were really deep in the reporting. It's because they weren't. Now, what's different is, at the end of the day, the administration was accountable to that reporting, whether Nixon's core voters cared about that reporting or not. On the other hand, I think you're absolutely right. And again, this is the intended consequence of this technology environment. It is to allow you to multitask. It is to allow you to expect things on demand. Amazon Prime is the greatest loss leader of all time. If someone is going to take 4 days to deliver something to me now, I think that's outrageous that it should take 4 days for something to be delivered to me. But the question is not how do you turn back? The question is how do we make one of the values, entertaining is a value, ubiquitous is a value, on-demand is a value, informing me ought to be a value, and that's something that we have to demand from the technology that we have. I will say that certainly you see ways that a younger generation is distracted. There's been a lot of reporting about the mental health effects. But you also see these Me Too is an incredible kind of community that's grown up and empowered people. I think in the US you have this amazing explosion in transgender rights. I think there's no question that that's partly the result of being able to retreat into a virtual community of interest that might not be proximate to you. So it's not a question of turning back. It's a question of not treating, again, tech as this inevitable march from us that's alienated from a set of choices that we can make and that we can demand of the people who are building the tools. We're building the tools. So we've got to get informed. That's not new. That's not a new function of democratic capitalism. What's new is the challenge of confronting that as consumers to this question, as governments, and as companies. There's no effective regulatory regime, I would say, that I've ever seen that didn't require all of those parts working together.
All right, Sam Gill, thanks very much for your time and your perspective.
This is great.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot.
Nice to see you. You were great, buddy. Nicely done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam and Kevin. And so now we're going to go into our breakout sessions. This afternoon we have, speaking of local news, we have the resurgence of local news, new content models.
And we have managing opinion. I know a lot of us are getting into the opinion state, and also the great platform debate. And then later on, we have audience metrics and the new revenue models and the future of wire services, and then a very special event at 5 o'clock.
At 5 o'clock, we have Lara Satrakian from she's the co-founder of Press Forward, which is an organization in the States in response to the Me Too movement, which is getting involved with newsrooms to change the culture within newsrooms. So I think that'll be a really great conversation.
Great. And which session is in which room? We do have it outside in some signs, and we'll figure that out. So everybody take a break, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do, and we're going to get underway in about 15 minutes, okay?
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.